You see, Captain Sparkles is launching a lawsuit with YouTube about the new policy changes. Wait, what? The lawsuit that could destroy YouTube.
Happy New Year, everybody. For my first
This
video
is
of
news to me,
2023,
actually.
I thought we'd talk about impending doom. Well, okay, that's still to be decided, but at the end of next month, February 21st, 2023, the United States Supreme Court is hearing arguments for a case called Gonzalez versus Google, which has major implications, not just for YouTube, actually, but for the entire internet. It's serious enough that, like, I'm low on the YouTube totem pole. I don't get invited to too many things these days, but I was even invited to a group call with YouTube employees, other creators, creator-adjacent business people to inform us of what this is and ask if we wanted to be part of something called an amicus brief, which will actually be used during arguments in the trial. So what is this case, Gonzalez versus Google, about? And why is it a big deal?
Give me the cliff notes on it. I've never heard of it.
A disclaimer. I have no formal legal background. I'm sure that'll be obvious to people. So there probably will be better videos on this from other YouTubers who are actually lawyers. Keep that in mind. I'll still do my best to give the info necessary for this. So before we get into
feed it to me.
Specifics of this
on
case,
a nice little plate
we need
so
to
I can
go back
understand.
to something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. This is where everyone tunes out. They're like, oh, God, sections and numbers, and I didn't come here for this. What the frick, dude? Yeah, I know, but bear with me.
That's how I would say,
because
what
it
the
is
fuck?
important, and like I said, the future of YouTube, at least in the form that we know it, does sort of hang in the balance here. So, what is Section 230? Well, perhaps the most important text in it says, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. What does that mean, simplified? Basically, it means that a website like YouTube
is it responsible for the content,
or Twitter, or any site that hosts a ton of user-generated content isn't responsible as a website for the speech, the posts that the users post on the site. You can't blame YouTube because someone posts a terrible, awful video where they say horrible things.
Yeah, that's been, so I didn't know it actually went this far back. That's commonplace. That's been what's protecting the major corporations that run the websites. Because if they were being held responsible for every piece of content on there, the moderation would have to crack down so fucking hard and everything would have to be in a very, very squeaky clean state. Otherwise, they'd risk opening themselves up to massive lawsuits if that protection wasn't in place. I didn't know that was Section 230. I didn't know what it was called. But yeah, that protection's been around for a very long time. It's a legitimate necessity. A website like YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, whatever, could not function without that protection being in place. It would crumble and die. So I'm assuming, since that's now being referenced, this Gonzalez versus Google case is about Section 230 being overturned's not the right word. Thrown out, replaced. Trying to hold the corporations responsible for like hate speech or something would be my guess. YouTube hosts a massive platform that's given rise to extremist content, and they need to be held responsible. Well, in doing so, you will then force them to be held responsible for every single piece of content generated on the site. That's going to be my guess as to what this is about then if this is being referenced.
And this is very important because it's in contrast to, let's call them legacy media outlets. So think newspapers, TV news outlets. Those are considered publishers in that they are seen as expressly authorizing what is put forth.
They review the content
in the articles.
It is their voice in it.
Verbally said on the TV station. So let's think of something like slander or libel. Say a newspaper publishes an article that accuses someone out there of doing terrible things, but
they're
those
responsible for the
things
words
aren't actually true. Well, that person can sue for libel, and the newspaper is responsible for having published that article.
Doesn't apply on YouTube,
here, which is protected by Section 230, is if someone goes on YouTube and says a bunch of slanderous things about someone, it's not YouTube's fault. You can sue the person who made that video, but you can't sue YouTube for hosting that piece of content. It's a very similar concept to the DMCA, which I think more people here are probably familiar with, in that what the DMCA is to copyrighted content, Section 230 is to speech. There is an important carve-out here that is different from the DMCA, though, and that states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be held liable on account of any voluntary action taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or users consider to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. Okay, this just means that sites are allowed to actually try to execute good faith moderation on the content that's
without
posted
being
to
held
them.
responsible
and as
for
opposed to the
overall,
DMCA,
yeah.
where if YouTube tries to be hands-on at all and says, "Oh, you
So
can't
then, what
post
does
this on our
Gonzalez
site,"
versus Google
they're no
want to
longer
change?
indemnified. They have to be totally hands-off. With Section 230, YouTube can make efforts to moderate really, really bad content.
Hold on. Let me look something up real quick. I feel like if this was really about getting rid of Section 230 protections, this would be a much bigger deal unless it somehow flew under the radar. Because just looking it up, I was curious how new it was. This was October of 2022. Or no, November of 2022. But this is also citing a case from October of 2022. How the fuck would this have flown under the radar for so long? Have people talked about this and it just hasn't been picked up by the majority of people? Because that is news to me. One question before the Supreme Court with Gonzalez versus Google is whether, under Section 230, a website or service develops content and therefore loses immunity when it uses an algorithm to recommend terrorist content based on users' viewing history. As the Artificial Intelligence Law and Policy Institute argued in an amicus brief before the Ninth Circuit, the court must determine if content recommendation algorithms are neutral facilitation tools or a means of developing user-tailored content. Wow. So this algorithm that they spent the last fucking 10 years fine-tuning to be the machine that it is today, maybe it's very undoing then if they're able to make that argument that now, since this algorithm is recommending content, they're no longer just immune. Because now, at this point, they're basically acting as like the publisher of it, like in the promotion of it, it seems. That seems to be the boiled down argument. The algorithm promoting terrorist content or the algorithm steering public discourse, like tailored content, is, I guess, being argued as them no longer just being like this hands-off God, what's the right word? Hub? They're now like a direct participant. Thus, they're now going to be held to the same standards of something like The Sun. That is very, very, very interesting. Holy shit. Huh. Oh my god. Yeah, that's a pretty fucking good argument. Like, this isn't baloney. Because they're not wrong. The YouTube algorithm will keep you in a bubble if you want it to, or if you let it. So let's say you are someone that... shit, this is a really morbid one. But there's a community on YouTube that likes to torture young monkeys. And if you watch one of those videos, YouTube recommends tons of people torturing monkeys. Like, it's a real fucked up thing, and the YouTube algorithm, in the way that it works, will continue to recommend that content. But under Section 230, they're not responsible for the content being there, but the algorithm promoting it is now being argued to be YouTube as kind of like almost being responsible for it because they're showing it to you. They're delivering this experience to you. So the same rules they're arguing shouldn't apply in a case like that. Yeah, so it's no longer just a neutral party since it's giving you the content. Like, It is feeding it to you. There's the Prime Kinky, and then you said Daffodil and Smed. And this would apply to all social media. Anything with algorithmic-driven content, it sounds like it would apply to. Here, let me fast forward to the Gonzalez case here, because I imagine Captain Sparkles gets deeper into it than my surface-level reading from this one article.
Search results. If you're searching for something, you have to rank the content that shows up somehow. Is that also considered algorithm at that point? And I actually asked this in the call that I mentioned earlier.
You don't just stumble on the monkey torture stuff? You don't. Just like you wouldn't stumble on most of the echo chambers you can get lost in. But the algorithm continuing to feed you that content is no longer the platform being neutral. It is actively giving you that. It is actively enabling you to get this content. Even if it's good, even if it's bad, doesn't matter. They are not neutral anymore. They're just providing you that content. They're like, oh, you like this? Here's more. And here's more of that. And here's more of this. Which they're now arguing is no longer just like this, hey, hands off, you find what you find, and it's not our fault.
I was told that there is precedent for Google search results to be protected. But again, even though this case is called Gonzalez versus Google, it is about YouTube. And so I'm sure that the defense will reference that, but I don't know that it's established precedent when it comes to YouTube search specifically. And so it's a very hard question to answer. What actually is the algorithm? This only applies, obviously, if the Supreme Court is thinking about ruling against Google here. But I guess that's why you're probably still here, is to find out what could actually happen if the court rules against Google on all counts. So, God forbid, let's envision a worst-case scenario here. We may not actually see immediate massive changes to YouTube. Because remember, this ruling wouldn't be, oh, the algorithm is now illegal, you can't make content recommendations.
It wouldn't just be the algorithm.
By making these content recommendations to viewers, you may now be held liable for what they've uploaded. So now,
thus, they'd have to crack down so fucking hard on every piece of content uploaded to YouTube, which they realistically can't do. They would have to play so safe on every upload, otherwise they risk being sued, otherwise they risk full legal action. Yeah. It's not just like, oh, okay, so the algorithm's going away, so it's going to go back to how YouTube used to be. Because now they're going to be responsible for every piece of content on the site.
Somebody goes and uploads a horrible, vile video that's a clear violation of the terms of service they agreed to when they made a Google account to be able to upload in the first place. But somebody sees it via an algorithmic means before it's taken down, and that person decides, I'm going to sue YouTube for this. And even if it's a frivolous lawsuit because it was a violation of the terms of service to begin with, YouTube has to defend that lawsuit. And defending lawsuits is very expensive. And if they start getting hit with enough of those, then it's going to be too expensive to keep the site operating in the way that it is. And at that point, they may be forced to start scaling back in places in order to avoid being hit by all of these lawsuits over and over, to the extent that the site can actually operate without being in jeopardy from them. So over time, if YouTube is hit with a deluge of these incoming lawsuits, does that mean that the only functions remaining are the ability to manually browse to a specific channel? That subscription feeds
that'd be a lot deeper than that.
That's active channels you've already hit the subscription button on, and therefore it's going to serve you content from them. Does search still work in the same way? Will that be carved out? Will it be exempt? But when you really think about it at the end of the day, as much as, I've complained about the algorithm here and there, usually that comes from like a selfish perspective, like, man, I wish it were recommending my content more. But what does YouTube actually look like? What do all of these websites look like without any form of algorithmic content recommendation?
No, he hasn't brought up the deeper point here, so maybe I'm misunderstanding from the article, but it seems like if they do rule against YouTube, it's not just like this algorithm needs to change, it's you are now responsible for this content. So it's not just a matter of, okay, no longer we're going to be really strict with our algorithm, we can't recommend anything bad. It's we can't have anything bad because if someone finds something bad, we can be sued for it. Whereas right now, that's just not the case because of the 230 protections. He just said that. You skipped that part. Oh, what? When? I thought this was him still just setting up what the case is, which I was looking for more like here's the ramifications. I can see what the case is. I've got it up. So I just didn't need the summary. I think its videos can't be recommended to you. No. From what I'm reading here, it seems like it's no longer going to be protected by the Section 230 rulings. Not just like it can't recommend to you anymore. This is still just the same article, though. So perhaps I'm off the mark. Maybe it's not as doom and gloom. These are resub Misty. In the Prime Fancy. But here, I'll go back to before I went to the epilogue
Case for
of the
things that get heard by the Supreme Court. Usually they are constitutional issues, and this is, in a way, a free speech issue. So will the court consider that a website, that YouTube recommending a piece of content to a viewer is an endorsement, is like a newspaper giving the okay to publish an article? Or will they see that almost all social media websites at this point, if not all of them, operate off of an algorithmic recommendation system?
Yep.
And to not give some sort of carve out there would more or less break the operations of all these websites. The scope of this is not even known, though. Like, where do you draw the line between what is considered algorithm and what is not? You might make the argument that videos recommended from channels you're not subscribed to on your homepage, maybe that's algorithm. Suggested videos to the side and bottom of the video you're watching, okay, maybe that's algorithm. But what about search results? If you're searching for something, you have to rank the content that shows up somehow. Is that also considered algorithm at that point? And I actually asked this in the call that I mentioned earlier, and I was told that there is precedent for Google search results to be protected. But again, even though this case is called Gonzalez versus Google, it is about YouTube. And so I'm sure that the defense will reference that, but I don't know that it's established precedent when it comes to YouTube search specifically. And so
So I see people in the chat once again saying, and this is him giving the recap of what's going on and like the scope of it. But again, it's not just the algorithm, at least not based on what I'm reading here. One question before the Supreme Court with Gonzalez versus Google is whether under Section 230 a website or service develops content and therefore loses immunity. When the algorithm recommends to terrorist content based on viewers' viewing history, as Artificial Intelligence Law and Policy Institute argued in the amicus brief before the Ninth Circuit, the court determined if content recommendation algorithms are the neutral facilitation tools or means of developing user-tailored content. This recommendation algorithms fall outside the scope of Section 230, and the ruling would have enormous implications on how websites would operate. This is like it's still independent of just the algorithm. It's now looking at the website as a whole. So any kind, and he does mention this, any kind of like a search result could be considered an endorsement. That's what I'm saying. It's not just like remove the algorithm and it's all fine. This seems to be arguing that at this point, at this stage, YouTube could be considered like endorsing the content. Is the argument. And if that's the case, it could no longer just house anything without it being strictly monitored before being published, I imagine. Anything served to you, which is a gray area, not anything they host. Right, and how do you define what's served to you? Which is what he's just now talking about as well. It's a very hard thing to determine. What is considered served to you? There's the Prime Zook. Yeah, of course, Snert. Who gets to determine this? Don't know. But here's some of the closing arguments here, I suppose. At least, well, not closing arguments. Some of the arguments. I'll read a few. Plaintiffs of the case argue that the defendant violated the Anti-Terrorism Act by communicating ISIS messages, radicalizing recruits, and furthering their mission. And 2, should be held liable for this content because it was promoted through targeted recommendations on its website. The plaintiff alleges that the promotion constituted Google's aiding and abetting in the promotion of recruitment efforts of these terrorist organizations. Through this, plaintiffs argue that YouTube provided material support to ISIS, that they had knowingly permitted ISIS to post hundreds of videos on YouTube, and that the services provided by the algorithm provided access to viewers to similar content. Quotes, were critical to the growth and activity of ISIS. So a big takeaway there is it's not just the promotion. They also say they had knowingly permitted ISIS to post hundreds of videos on YouTube. That's just targeting the actual posting of that content. So the fact it was housed there, and they are now trying to argue that they should be held liable. And the fact that the algorithm promoted it should be used as a case against them having 230 protections. So this is like a really large scope case. If they started promoting videos on bomb making, I'd imagine they'd be liable. And you wouldn't be wrong. That's the argument they're making here, but with ISIS instead of bomb making. And in doing so, it targets the entire thing. Like, if they're being held liable for this, they will also be held liable for whatever else. How to get away with murder. Here's weird people torturing animals over here. This and that. They'd be held liable in every single other avenue as well. But then that also extends to anything. They would now be held liable for every piece of content. Meaning, if you wanted to post your Minecraft Let's Play, and let's say you use some hate speech in the middle of it, they'd be held liable for that. Like, oh, okay, so you're enabling people to say some slurs. It'd be very dangerous for them to allow content that they couldn't strictly moderate and approve beforehand. Just like a paper, making sure they don't publish something like that. At least that's how I understand it. .230 would still apply though, so YouTube would have to have like a message board without algorithms. But that's where it's so gray though, because, well, I guess a message board would be a little different, because then you could say it's user generated, thus we have no say in it. The users are posting it and blowing it up, not us. But just even enabling a search function, you could then argue like the top search results, that's YouTube endorsing these things, and there could be bad things there. Thus, that'd still be a risk. Thanks to the Prime, dying, and Darth Lightyear in Borderline. Not if by likes. Well, that'd be a totally different system. Yeah, they'd have to come up with something else that's entirely user-focused somehow. Top search result is user-generated. No, it's generated based off of what you usually watch. It's catered to you, your channel. Like what you're usually watching. There's a Prime Hope. It's both. I don't know about both. I've never had that be the case. Top vids is always based on like your watch history and what the algorithm thinks that you're most likely to click on based on your search. That's why two people are going to get two different search results if you type in the same thing. He says in the video that Google's search results are protected by precedent, but he then again says that there's no telling if that applies to YouTube itself. That's applying to like searching for information on Google. So unclear if that would apply to YouTube with that precedent. Let me get back. I think he was mentioning it here.
Amended their content in some place. Search results, sure, but if I look in my YouTube analytics, over the course of my YouTube history, the majority of people who are here watching this, you discovered my content algorithmically. And without that, it's just going to crush potential for future growth for channels.
That
And
is
you
true,
have
but I think it's
people
much
who've
bigger than
obviously
that.
invested their livelihoods
There's
in
a
building up
lot
the channel.
more
You
for
have
it.
people who recently got to the point where they can do it full time. Well, that's not viable anymore. They can't grow. There's no more algorithm to push their content and expose them to new viewers. I might be okay because I've been at it for so many years and I've been able to build up an existing audience that may still be able to find my videos through subscriptions, but it would still hurt dramatically. Still, at least half the people who watch every video of mine are not subscribed. They're finding that content somehow. Some may be searching for me directly, but I would bet a huge majority are being found in suggested videos, recommendations on the home page. And without that, viewership plummets. If people have to go out of their way to try
This is
to
all very
discover
true. Yeah, he's
new
not wrong about
content,
any of this.
it's
That's a good
going to
point.
dramatically decrease the amount of interaction that content's going to see. So in the long term, you see massive loss of jobs. There are creators out there who may get tons and tons of views, but they also employ a ton of people. They have a lot of overhead. And all of a sudden, if you decrease that viewership even by 10, 20%, they're not able to meet their payroll. And the thing is, if YouTube falls, that's the final domino, right? They are the biggest, most well-capitalized entity to be able to try to defend against this and keep the site running without changes for the longest in the event that this case is ruled against them. Every other site at that point, smaller websites that are dependent
Anything
on algorithmic
algorithmically
recommendations,
based, yep.
they're done. They're gone. They're not operating anymore. It's impossible. And so it's not just creators who get destroyed. There's also going to be employee job loss at tech social media companies across the board. And so while I'm not a constitutional scholar who can really determine how Section 230 applies to algorithmic recommendations, what I focused on in my contribution to the amicus brief was simply that these algorithmic recommendations, despite
Tier 1
maybe
Sierra.
having an occasional shortfall, have contributed tremendously to job growth and people being able to make a living and are necessary for these sites to be able to operate the way they do and are, I think, a net positive. Despite, again, everything that I've complained about in the past, I do believe that content recommendation systems are a net positive to websites and helping to allow creators to do what they do. Again, though, I do just want to remind that is an absolute worst case scenario. And in my...
I still don't think that's the worst case scenario, though. Because, again, going back to here, the legal question at the heart of this matter is to determine the following. Does Section 230, mentioning 230 by name, which is the protections in place for websites like YouTube, Twitter, whatever, where they're not responsible, like legally responsible for the content that users generate to protect them from things like a terrorist uploading a beheading video or something. They're not responsible for that. By mentioning Section 230 here and then talking about how content currently works, it feels like it's more of a threat to the protections put in place on the website as a whole, even if it's mainly like focused on the targeting. So does Section 230 immunize interactive computer services when they make targeted recommendations of information provided by another information content provider, or only limit the liability of interactive computer services when they engage in traditional editorial functions, such as deciding whether to display or withdraw with regards to such information? Like, to me, all of this seems much bigger. Should they rule against Google, it feels more like not only will the algorithm have to completely not exist. I don't see how they'd be able to anymore because you'd never be able to make an argument against it once that's overturned. They would also then have to strictly moderate what goes up because it's such a gray area on what you can consider targeted content, like what is getting recommended to you. It's just such a huge risk I don't see any companies taking. I mean, it's what the world needs. That's really short-sighted. So let's say, like right now, let's use like, I'm trying to think of something that's not too extreme because I don't want to go like too crazy with it. Right now, someone is being real politically incorrect. He's saying like some real bad things. He's making points about like, oh, this group is so inferior. They're such shit. This and that. Like, they're fucking terrible. They're awful. Like, right now, that person might find their way in the algorithm and you can be like, oh, that's terrible. They're promoting this. And then from here, I'm finding all these other people. But now let's envision a future where that algorithm's not there. And now they have to strictly moderate every piece of content. Obviously, they wouldn't approve of that guy. But who's to say that going forward they would then approve of someone else who's just saying something kind of innocent that's not nearly as bad? It's like, oh, I'm playing this game and I made a joke about this guy being real bad at the game. I'm like, oh, bro, you fucking suck. Like, this is very toxic. Is that allowed? Should we allow? Like, does that open us up to any kind of possibility? Or like CoffeeZilla did an investigation on Logan Paul, but it's not an officially conducted investigation. Is there a chance that we just platformed a completely fraudulent, defamatory statement? Like, it becomes this big gray area where it's like, fuck, what's going to open us up to that responsibility? That's just free speech, which is threatened here. Because the 230 section is about protecting it. They can easily moderate their content with AI. No, they can't. That would be a problem. Because right now they already do that, and that's become a big issue because here, as mentioned, it allowed ISIS to promote hundreds of videos, post hundreds of videos on the platform. It would then need to be a massive overhaul and be manually reviewed in order to make sure that doesn't happen again. And it'd be much more serious. They already suppress discerning political opinions. But you can still find them. Like, imagine if you right now search for a discerning political opinion, you can find it and a ton of creators and keep yourself in that bubble. You can do that for anything. I mentioned that monkey torture ring. If you look into the monkey torture ring, watch a video, you can find the entire echo chamber. It's all still there. Which is obviously like a bad thing. You don't want that to be promoted, but that's the reality of it at the moment. And then if they rule against YouTube and it's like, this is no longer protected by Section 230, you are responsible now because you have recommended this. It is you endorsing this content. They're going to be very, 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 very selective on what can even be posted in the first place. They'd have to be. Or they'd constantly just risk being open to a lawsuit. Only verified channels up. Okay, then no other creators ever allowed to post on YouTube. So then you have no small creators anymore, you have no new creators, and you have no new viral videos because you're not a verified account. There's a prime harrowing. Plus, that's just so fucking dystopian. Only trusted uploaders can upload onto YouTube. I'm hoping that this article I'm reading is kind of like overly fear enticing, and it's actually much more grounded in the things that Captain Sparkles is focusing on what it means for like the actual creator atmosphere. But it just seems to me like it's a lot bigger than just that. Because he does mention it, this would affect anything that uses an algorithm, which is every social media platform, and really every platform. I don't think there's a solution for that. Well, you need to carve off some kind of like stipulation to get like with the modern times. Like algorithms control every piece of information out there. It is what it is, and everyone benefits it, and everyone benefits from it, even though it might not seem that way. Like even the guy who mentioned the discerning political opinions being suppressed, without the algorithm, they wouldn't exist. They just wouldn't even be allowed on these platforms that don't like that. Like let's say it's run by someone who just doesn't like your political opinion, they would probably just not allow it because it opens them up to a potential liability with it. So no matter where you stand, you do still benefit from it. At least, I'm just learning about this. It's very possible that all of this I'm reading here from this, which does seem like a pretty reputable website, could still just be a little overblown, perhaps, on the scope of the potential. I would like to hear more from, like, lawyers and stuff, as Captain Sparkles mentions. I think he's done a great job breaking it down, like in its like most plain state. Like, here's what it means, here's what it is.
12, almost 13 years now on YouTube. I feel like we've seen enough legislative scares, SOPA, PIPA, the end of net neutrality, that have come and passed and not ended up being nearly the apocalypse they were promised to be. So I also have hope that that will end up being the case here. But it's also good not to get complacent and be aware of things like this. And even though in this case there isn't quite as direct a way to participate, you can always call up your local representative and voice your concerns in the matter, in the hope that maybe at some point there can be legislation that is actually passed in order to enforce that algorithmic content recommendations are concretely protected by Section 230, despite what may end up turning out from this case. If there are elements that are ruled against Google, there could always be legislation in the future that is passed in order to protect this sort of thing. So it's good to be aware of. I haven't seen too much coverage on this, interestingly
Yeah,
enough.
I didn't hear about this shit at all.
Yet it was the first time that I was asked if I wanted to get on a call with YouTube employees and other creators to discuss it, which I did find interesting. Maybe as the trial gets closer, we'll start hearing more about it, but I still thought it was worth making the video, putting it out there, putting it on your radar in case it's of interest, and we'll just have to wait to see how it plays out. I do hope that algorithmic content recommendations will be able to remain. As much as I've complained, again, I do think it's necessary. So with that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
That was a very, very informative video there. Jesus. Only in moderation can this be accounted for. That's just so delusional. Billions upon billions and billions and billions of minutes of content is uploaded every hour to YouTube. If it can't